So when Jesus was born, wise men came to Herod in Jerusalem. They came from the east. They followed the star. And they asked Herod, "Where is he who has been born the King of the Jews? For we've seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." The wise men believed that there was going to be a literal king who would rule on the earth, who was the King of the Jews. And Herod also believed that this was a possibility, and that's why he had all the baby boys in Bethlehem under 2 years of age, why he had them killed. There is going to be a literal kingdom over which Christ will rule. The people in Jesus' day were actually expecting their Messiah to be coming like any time. And they had the prophecy of the 70 weeks of Daniel that sort of pinpointed for them the approximate, if not like the exact year when they would expect their Messiah to arrive. The Jews were expecting a real person to come and overthrow the Romans and usher in the kingdom where Israel would be the head and not the tail. They were looking forward to a for reals kingdom over which their Messiah would rule. They were looking forward to the time when they would no longer be under oppression, but that their Messiah, their king, would arrive and lead them into all the promises that go with the millennial age that we read about in the Old Testament. The Old Testament passages sometimes use the phrase, the day of the Lord, when they're talking about this kingdom age. They use the phrase, the day of the Lord, or the great day, or that day, and it's not a reference to a single day. It's usually a reference to this whole kingdom age, this whole messianic age. So let's take a look at a few of the Old Testament passages that would have been familiar to the people living in Jesus' day, familiar to first century Christians, how they would have understood the day of the Lord or that day. The first passage that I want to look at is in Micah 4, verses 1 through 4. And this passage describes what will be taking place during what we call the millennium and what first century people would have known of as being the day of the Lord. "It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established on the highest of mountains, and it shall be lifted up above the hills, and peoples shall flow to it, and many nations shall come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall decide between many peoples, and shall decide disputes for strong nations far away. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. But they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. For the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken." So this next passage from Jeremiah 31 is probably the most important passage to understanding that God's promises for Israel are literal and that they will extend into a literal kingdom that's here on the earth. This is very specific. It's very clear. We're not talking allegories here. We're talking about a literal kingdom involving a literal people springing from Abraham, a literal Israel. Let's start with verse 31 of Jeremiah 31. "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them. I will write it on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, Know the Lord. For they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. And here's where the promise is. Verse 35, for thus says the Lord, who gives the sun for light by day, and the fixed order of the moon and stars for light by night, who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar. The Lord of hosts is his name. If this fixed order departs from before me, declares the Lord, then shall the offspring of Israel cease from being a nation before me forever. Thus says the Lord, if the heavens above can be measured and the foundations of the earth below can be explored, well, then I will cast off all of the offspring of Israel for all that they have done, declares the Lord. But the promise is God is not going to cast off the nation of Israel. Isaiah 9, 6 and 7, so appropriate for this time of year. We're in December, the week before Christmas. For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. And on the throne of David, over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. So let's take a look at Isaiah chapter 2, verses 12 through 21. For the Lord of hosts has a day against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up, and it shall be brought low, against all the cedars of Lebanon, lofty and lifted up, and against all the oaks of Bashan, against all the lofty mountains, and against all the uplifted hills, against every high tower, and against every fortified wall, and against all the ships of Tarshish, and against all the beautiful craft. And the haughtiness of man shall be humbled, and the lofty pride of men shall be brought low, and the Lord alone shall be exalted at that day. And the idols shall utterly pass away, and the people shall enter the caves of the rocks and the holes of the ground, from before the terror of the Lord and from the splendor of his majesty, when he rises to terrify the earth. In that day, mankind will cast away their idols of silver and their idols of gold, which they've made for themselves to worship, to the moles and the bats, to enter the caverns of the rocks and the clefts of the cliffs, from before the terror of the Lord and from the splendor of his majesty, when he rises to terrify the earth. Joel 2, verses 10, 11, and 19. The earth quakes before them, the heavens tremble, the sun and the moon are darkened, and the stars withdraw their shining. The Lord utters his voice before his army, for his camp is exceedingly great. He who executes his word is powerful. For the day of the Lord is great and very awesome. Who can endure it? The Lord answered and said to his people, Behold, I am sending to you grain, wine, and oil, and you will be satisfied, and I will no more make you a reproach among the nations. The Jews were looking forward to the time when their Messiah would rule. The prophets often referred to the coming rule of the Messiah as the day of the Lord, or the day, or the great day, or that day. The Bible tells us that the Jews desired the day of the Lord, and they understood that that day would result in them being a reproach no more, when the wolf would lie down with the lamb and the little child would lead them. They weren't always so aware of the fact that the day or that day would start out with terror, that it would start out with wrath. They assumed that it was only their enemies that would be having trouble. But the prophet Amos points out that this time, the day of the Lord, the beginning of the day of the Lord, would also be a time of trouble for Israel as well. Amos 5, 18 and 20. Woe to you who desire the day of the Lord. Why would you have the day of the Lord? It is darkness and not light. Is not the day of the Lord darkness and not light? and gloom with no brightness in it? Isaiah 13:6, wail, for the day of the Lord is near. As destruction from the Almighty it will come. Ezekiel 33, for the day of the Lord is near. The day of the Lord is near. It will be a day of clouds, a time of doom for the nations. Joel 1:15, alas for that day, for the day of the Lord is near, and as destruction from the Almighty it comes. So those are the Old Testament passages that the people in Jesus' day would have been familiar with. So when someone is talking about the day of the Lord, they would see it as being something that was really good, as the time when the Messiah would reign and usher in this golden age, this wonderful kingdom of peace where Israel would be the head of the nations. They kind of minimized the whole idea, though, that this would also usher in a time of terror and wrath and gloom that would come upon the whole earth. So the New Testament writers and the New Testament readers would have understood what the day of the Lord was. The Apostle Peter also wrote about the day of the Lord in 2 Peter chapter 3. And he describes both the beginning of the day of the Lord, how the day of the Lord will end, and actually how long the day of the Lord is. Peter understood this concept of what we call the great day of the Lord. The great day is that 1,000-year day, which is part of a larger great week of human history. 7,000 years of human history will culminate in 1,000-year day of rest. So the 7 days of creation that we read about in the book of Genesis are going to be the pattern for God's day, God's great week. And the last 1,000-year day of his great week is the day of the Lord, that day, or the great day. Here's what Peter has to say about the 1,000 years. 2 Peter 3, verse 8. Do not overlook this one fact, beloved, but that with the Lord, one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as one day. According to the book of Revelation and what we read in the Old Testament from the prophets, the world is actually going to be free of the influence of Satan during the day of the Lord. People will no longer learn war, that the implements of war will be beaten into implements of agriculture, spears into pruning hooks, and so on. And the reason why the world will not have this satanic influence anymore is twofold. The first one is that we read that Satan will be bound in the pit for 1,000 years so that he can no longer deceive the nations. He'll be released at the end of the 1,000 years, but for 1,000 years, there is no satanic deception going on. And the other idea that most people don't talk about very much, but which is part of the end times, is the demons, the fallen angels, the fallen entities who had relations with human women back prior to the flood. All of these foul and terrible angels and demons and so on, hybrids, are going to be put into the lake of fire before Christ begins his reign, so that when he reigns on the earth, there is no deception going on, whether it's from Satan, from his minions, from the demons, from fallen angels. There is no deception. It will be a kingdom of righteousness and peace, and the only issues that'll be on the earth are the issues that come because they're the people, the mortal people who are living on earth at that time, still will have a sin nature. So sin will still be a problem. But if you don't have Satan and the demons and all of those fallen ones making things worse, that whole sin problem can be mitigated a little bit better. So the conditions on the earth will actually return back to what we see pre-flood. Children will live to be very old. People will die because death is the last enemy to be destroyed. So people will still die during the millennium, but they will live to be very old. And everybody is going to be provided for. Everybody will have their own vine and their own fig tree, and they will sit in peace underneath their trees and enjoy their property and enjoy their inheritance from the Lord. The earth will be renovated, it will be rejuvenated and made beautiful and productive once more. So Peter condenses this whole 1,000 years of the last day into one short verse. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. Okay, and that's kind of what Paul says. We'll look at some of that later. It will come like a thief. And then the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and the works that are in it will be exposed. So the day of the Lord is the 7th 1,000-year day in the 7,000-year week, encompassing the millennial reign of Christ. This day will begin unexpectedly like a thief. The day will end 1,000 years later with the heavens being destroyed and the earth being destroyed in a huge conflagration of fire. And we know from Revelation that God will do away with the present heaven and present earth and create a new heaven and a new earth. Revelation 20:11 through 21:1. Then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it, and from his presence earth and sky fled away, and there was no place found for them. And then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. 2 Peter 3:11 through 13. Since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be in lives of holiness and godliness, waiting for and hastening the coming, the parousia, of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be set on fire and dissolved, and the heavenly bodies will melt as they burn. But according to his promise, we are waiting for a new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. So Peter says that the day of the Lord is going to come like a thief in the night. Well, Paul says that too. He also mentions this thief in the night aspect of the day of the Lord. 1 Thessalonians 5:1 through 3. Now, as to the times and seasons, brothers and sisters, you have no need of anything to be written to you. For you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord is coming like a thief in the night. While they're saying peace and safety, then sudden destruction will come upon them like labor pains upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. So Paul says in this passage here in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 that the people that he was writing to didn't need to be instructed about the day of the Lord. They totally understood that the day of the Lord was going to come like a thief. It was going to come by surprise, just like Peter said in 2 Peter chapter 3. And 2 Peter chapter 3 is talking about the millennium. The day of the Lord is the millennium. And we can actually use the millennium and the day of the Lord as being synonymous. They're the same thing. It's the kingdom age, the messianic age. So if we were to insert the word millennium into this passage in 1 Thessalonians 5, this is what it would read. Now, as to the times and seasons, brothers and sisters, you have no need of anything to be written to you. For you yourselves know full well that the millennium is coming like a thief in the night. While they're saying peace and safety, then sudden destruction will come upon them like labor pains upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. Paul is telling them that they know, those people, the Thessalonians, they know that the day of the Lord, the millennium, is going to come like a surprise. It's going to come like a thief in the night. They know that it is the great day, the day of the Lord, the same day that Peter was talking about in 2 Peter chapter 3. The day of the Lord, or the millennium, is going to begin with people being caught unawares. Okay, the people who are living at that time will be caught unawares. And it's going to end with the destruction of the present heaven and earth. And in between those two cataclysms, the darkness and the cloudiness and the gloom that is the beginning of the day of the Lord, and the end of the day of the Lord, which is the dissolution of all elements, in between those is the millennial reign of Christ, the day of the Lord when he'll rule and reign. So the coming of the Lord, that is Christ and his parousia, is related to the day of the Lord, or the millennium. Christ is going to come and then he's going to rule. Those two ideas, the parousia and the day of the Lord, are connected. Okay, they belong together because Christ is going to come and then he's going to rule. And in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 4 and verse 8, Paul talks about the connection between the coming, or the parousia of the Lord, and the day of the Lord. And he actually is able to put the day of the Lord in a window of time. And this window of time is going to be echoed in other passages of Scripture, specifically in Matthew chapter 24. In the next video, we're going to be talking about 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and this connection between the parousia of the Lord and the day of the Lord, and this little mini timeline that Paul gives us in 2 Thessalonians. So just to kind of recap things for you, there is going to be a literal return of Christ to the earth. He's going to set up a literal kingdom. The kingdom will be operated from a literal city of Jerusalem on this very planet that we live on, and Israel will be the head of the nations. People will go up to Jerusalem to worship the Lord. And the Old Testament prophets and the New Testament writers both refer to this same period of time as the day of the Lord. So when you see the day of the Lord in the New Testament, whenever you see that, you should think millennium. This is the millennium. This is the kingdom age, the messianic age. The kingdom age will come like a thief with woe and darkness and destruction and gloom, and it will end with everything being dissolved and the creation of a new heavens and a new earth. Okay, so that is the day of the Lord. In the next video, we're going to make these connections and hopefully understand this little mini timeline that Paul gives us in 2 Thessalonians. So I hope you've enjoyed this video and you've learned something from it. If you have, leave a comment in the comments section, and we'll see you on another video. Till then, have a blessed day.